And I just say it's a joy to be here, especially you saints of Grace Harbor Church. I love you. It's such a joy to see you and to meet those of you that are new, even since last time I was here. But one way to summarize Job 3 to 37 is simply that there comes a time in suffering where human wisdom runs out. As wise as human wisdom may be or may seem to be, there's just a limit to it. There's a limit to its ability to explain or to comfort us in certain times of suffering. And thus, here's maybe, if you were looking for a key point from these 35 chapters, here's one that you could make, that the comfort we ultimately need in our suffering is found beyond human wisdom. It's found in God's wisdom. And knowing this, acknowledging this, ultimately trusting this is one way, one part of suffering well, which is what this talk is meant to be about. And so this section of this story of Job, it is all about humans, both Job and his friends. It's all about humans attempting with their own wisdom, much of which is generally true, but it's them attempting to explain the circumstances and the suffering that has befallen Job. And in fact, I think a big part of what we're actually invited to ask as readers of the story in these chapters is, who is truly wise? Like, who, in all these conversations in these chapters, that's one of the things, who's the wise person? Who has the wise perspective, the correct understanding theologically and otherwise of Job's suffering? Is it Job or is it his friends? And one of the main points, both theologically and literarily, that the author wants us to see as readers is ultimately the futility of man's wisdom when it comes to offerings and explanations of comfort for Job's suffering. Again, because the comfort we ultimately need in our suffering is found in our God, who alone is wise. Who's the wise one? God. And so if you want to read these chapters later, here's kind of a structure, a main kind of overview, and we're going to walk through these sections one by one. But Job 3 is Job's lament about his suffering. That's chapter 3. Chapters 4 to 27 is Job's 3 rounds of dialogues with his 3 friends about his suffering. Job 4 to 14 is the first round of conversations. Job 15 to 21 is the second round of conversations. Job 21 to 27 is the third round of conversations. Obviously, these conversations dominate this section of the story. And then in Job 28, there's a poem, or what we might call a hymn, Job's hymn of God's wisdom. Then chapters 29 to 31, Job gives one last final speech or defense. And then in Job 32 to 37, the young buck named Elihu comes and he gives a speech. He's got some words to say as he's been listening all throughout to these conversations, and he's got something he wants to add. So that's the overview. You're going to walk through them one by one, these sort of sections, and we'll spend more time really in the second section, chapters 4 to 27, than the others, but we'll just try to glean some wisdom from God here. So Job 3 is this lament, and we're not going to spend much time here in chapter 3, but if you're looking there with me, as I reread some of this week, this chapter struck me the deepest personally as I looked at it, and though dire and even incredibly dark at points, the depth of the pain of Job's lament, it really does resonate with me so deeply. And to be candid, I've struggled with clinical depression since I was 3 years old. At 3 years old, doctors tried to give me an antidepressant. It's been a big part of my story, some of the darkness of depression. And so, some of what, as I was rereading this, it was like I'd never read it before. Just it put words to some of the feelings I've endured in various seasons of my own life, and it gives this real vulnerable glimpse at, I think, the mental and emotional and the psychological pain and anguish that so often accompanies our suffering. So even I'll just look at verse 11 with me and following. This is just a selection of the lament. He says, "Why was I not a stillborn Why didn't I die as I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me, and why were there breasts for me to nurse? Now I would certainly be lying down in peace, I would be asleep. Then, if that had been the case, then I would be at rest with the kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruined cities for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not hidden like a miscarried child, like infants who never see daylight? There, at least, the wicked cease to make trouble and the weary find rest. The captives are completely at rest. They don't hear a taskmaster's voice. Both small and great are there, and the slave is set free from his master. All these images, these horrible images that are pouring forth from his heart, out of his mouth, in this lament. And this is just a selection, but part of what I love so much about the story of Job is the gift of an exemplar, of an example of how to grieve that the story of Job presents us. And there's an emerging proverb in our culture that says something along the lines of that the pain that we don't transform in our lives, we will transmit. The pain that we don't transform in our lives, that's not transformed, if you want to make it a little bit more passive, we transmit to others. In other words, we'll carry that pain forward and we'll pass it along to those closest to us. And I think there's a lot of deep truth to that statement. We live in a culture, and we certainly worship, most of us among Christian subculture, that does not value or even know how to lament. That is not a strength of our culture, generally speaking. There are certainly some exceptions, certain communities, especially those that have been through horrendous suffering from the beginning here in our country and our culture. You think about African American communities and how they actually give us language to lament. They've taught us and other communities like them how to lament in all sorts of different ways. But generally speaking, culture more broadly here in the United States, and certainly, again, Christian subculture, we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to identify or to acknowledge even at times our own hurt and pain. And for 1,000 different reasons, we're certainly not skilled or committed to grieving. I mean, who wants to do that? When there's goodness and happiness to be found, why would we do that? And so indeed, in our culture, we typically only face and enter into grief when we're forced to, when it's no longer optional. For some of us, when our bodies shut down and tell us, you are done. It is time actually now to cry. It's time actually to not get out of bed. I'm not going to let you get up because you're carrying this that needs to be healed. It's got to come out. And to me, again, that's so beautiful about what's held forth for us here in this part of the story of Job, is this process that he went through for his pain to be transformed, starting here with his unblushing acknowledgement of his pain. He did not avoid his pain. He did not avoid naming his pain. He acknowledged it. You ever tried to put your pain, think about your pains that you carry. Like even this week, your wounds that you picked up in a conversation with your spouse, or with your children, or with your parents, or with your friends at school. Like even just this week. Like you ever tried to put that pain into words, much less to paper? That's hard work to do that, which is why most of us, we don't do it. And so to look at the depth of Job's lament here, if we'll really receive it, it sort of takes our breath away that he did it. And now we get to read it and receive it, and it shows us as we do so how devastated Job was, even if as it models for us what to do with our own hurts, what to do with our own pain, how to look it in the face and lament it, which is, if nothing else, is a model that Job gives us here of not stuffing our pain, not just moving past it. Right? You don't go straight from death to resurrection. Between Good Friday and Easter Sunday is Holy Saturday. And Job provides about as good of a glimpse as anyone of what Saturday feels like, right? Part of suffering well and of pursuing and posturing ourselves before God for our pain to be transformed so that we don't transmit it into the lives of other people. is following after Job's example here. An example, of course, that was echoed and most beautifully embodied by the Lord Jesus Christ when he cried out in lament as he was hanging on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which, by the way, is an echo of the Psalm of Lament, Psalm 22. And so this is likewise the heart of Job's lament here in chapter 3. Look at verses 25 to 26. He says, "For the thing I feared has overtaken me." You ever felt that way? What I dreaded, what I most dreaded happening has happened to me. I cannot relax. I cannot be calm. I am dysregulated emotionally and physically in all sorts of ways. I have no rest, for turmoil has come. And as readers, as wise readers here, we can't help but to slow down and ask ourselves, even as we look at Job's example of how to suffer well, at least in terms of acknowledging it and facing it, is to ask ourselves, what is that thing we fear, that which we dread most? Like Morgan gave us an example. Like, what if it happened might overtake us, might leave us unable to relax or be calm, but just in perpetual restless turmoil? And for some of us in this room, man, we don't have to imagine because it's already happened, or maybe it feels like it's happening to you. And what I want us to just simply see together for us, for our churches, is that Job's lament here in chapter 3, it provides us an exemplar. It provides us a model. It provides us perhaps even an invitation to posture ourselves in the midst of our suffering to be healed by God by acknowledging our pain, not by stuffing it, which never really works. It just, again, we stuff it, but it gets transmitted to the next generation. Not by stuffing it, by looking it in the face and just naming it. This is my marriage. And my marriage right now is really bad. And this is my circumstance in my relationship with my child. I mean, right now, it's really painful. And on we could go. This is my relationship with the Lord. And Job shows us it's not only safe, but it's good and right to acknowledge to God and to others our deep hurt and pain. And so I'd say in that sense, like doing that, lamenting even provides us a sort of foothold to suffer well. And so that's chapter 3. Chapters 4 to 27, this next section is Job's rounds of conversations with his friend. And this is the longest section that we'll look at here in these chapters, the one we'll spend the most time with. And these three cycles of conversation, if you go read them later, you'll notice they are brilliantly and poetically arranged. That is, they're speaking in poetry to one another, and what we're meant to take from that is that these aren't exactly the conversations verbatim that happened, right? They didn't speak to each other in poetry back in the day, Job and his friends, any more than we do, okay? And they're arranged this way on purpose, though, and it's beautiful. And it's important, I think, for us to understand, both theologically but literally speaking, that Job's friends, as well as Job, they personify here in these chapters the best of the human wisdom of their day. These are the wisest guys in town. These are the elders, right? These are the ones that embody wisdom. And in particular, as Morgan mentioned, Job's three friends, they represent the age-old wisdom that's known as retribution theology. Retribution theology, as Morgan pointed out, or what some just refer to as the retribution principle of wisdom, is this, that if a person is righteous, then he or she will prosper. And of course, a corollary of that is that if a person is wicked, he or she will suffer. And biblical scholars, all of them will point out, which is why Morgan pointed it out at the very beginning, that if we want to read Job wisely, then it's crucial for us to know that in the time of Job and in the Old Testament period more broadly, this principle was widely embraced as true, as deeply true by the people of God and by their neighbors as well. And in fact, this principle of the retribution wisdom was so central to their view of God's character and particularly his justice, that is really what is being debated in these chapters. If you have eyes to see it. That is, that listen, people knew that their God was just, that in his character he was just and good, in no small part because he was a God who delighted to bless his people and the nations who feared him and walked in his ways. You're a good God. You're a just God because you take care of your people. You bless your people as they honor you and seek to hallow your name. And also because he was a God who likewise was committed to punishing the wicked, those people and those nations who did not fear him and did not walk in his ways, and in fact walked in unrighteousness and abhorrent wickedness and injustice. Indeed, how could God be just, much less good or loving, if he wasn't like this? Right? You understand the logic of that? And so this was central, not just to their theology because they wanted to have their systematics in a row. This was fundamental because it went straight to their view of who their God was. And this conviction about God, particularly his justice and his wisdom and his sovereignty and his actions in the world, it is at front and center in the story of Job, in particularly these chapters. And indeed, as Morgan pointed out, again, from the very beginning of the story, God's justice, that's what Satan was actually contending against. He's questioning God's judgment or justice. Right? He's basically, as Morgan said, he's saying, yeah, your commitment to bless the righteous, it's actually counterproductive to the true development of righteousness among your people. Right? You've rigged the system. Of course they love you, as Morgan said. You bless them. That's the only reason they love you. That's what it means when when Satan says to God, does Job fear you for nothing? And so Satan is challenging God by saying, listen, if you stopped blessing people like Job, they wouldn't love you or honor you anymore. And so what I want you to sense in that, just echoing what Morgan so beautifully taught, is that it's God, not Job, who Satan is testing here ultimately. Right? Talk about Job's testing. Certainly he went through that. But Satan is testing God. God is the one on trial, as it were, here in the story of Job. A trial that starts in chapters 1 and 2 with the Satan, but then it actually, here as it unfolds, grows into Job himself putting God on trial as well. As Job questions how a wise and sovereign God can be just if he allows a righteous person to suffer. That's what's here, friend, at the heart of the story. And so as one scholar put it, I really like this. He said, quote, at stake in the book of Job is whether or not God truly loves Job, right? Not whether or not Job's going to love God. Does God truly love Job? And whether Job's love for God and his neighbors ultimately means anything at all. God, do you truly love me? This is what suffering causes us to question. Do you truly love me? How could you truly love me? And by the way, has my love for you and others meant anything at all? That's what's at stake here. This is ultimately the deepest problem that not just Job, but all of us face in our own suffering at its most painful points, combined with our weakest points. These are the same things that we question. Does God truly love us? Has it even mattered that we've loved him and we've loved others and we've sought to do what's right as imperfectly as it's been? And just like Job, we often ourselves put God on trial with these kinds of questions in our suffering and in our weakness. But friends, what I want you to see, though, is that everyone in the story of Job, Satan, Job, his friends, all of them assume that the retributive principle is true. And in these 3 rounds of conversations between Job and his friends in chapters 4 to 27, that theology is the basic foundation of the wise counsel that they go round and round and round about. It's based on that principle. So look at verse 4, verses 7 to 9. You'll see this with Eliphaz. He says this to Job based on that. He says, think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, Those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. You're reaping what you've sown, Job. We all know that, is what his friend tells him. And then Bildad, he's the next one who says in verse 3 of chapter 8, he says, God doesn't pervert justice. Then if you look at verse 6 there in chapter 8, he tells Job that if you are pure and upright, surely then God will rouse himself and restore you. Then Zophar, he comes along, and he accuses Job of mocking God as he maintains, because Job in all these conversations, Job maintains his innocence, right? We know that as readers. We know that he's innocent. We just read about it. But he maintains his innocence. And his friends, man, they come at him. And he says, that he's clean in God's sight, Job does in chapter 11, verse 4. And then he assures Job, this good friend of his, verse 6 of chapter 11, God exacts less of you than your guilt deserves. So again, this is the nature of the conversation, and it's all about the wisdom that's based in this theology that they're all assuming. And what I want you to see, it's easy for us as Christians to stand here this afternoon in this conference and get on a panel. It's easiest for us to mock the counsel of these three friends, isn't it? I would point out that they sat with Job for 7 days quiet and wept. I've never done that. So as much as this is how they get caricatured. It's like the scribes and Pharisees in Christian churches and preaching. These guys get ridiculed. They just become characters of what idiot friends do. It's like, no, they actually put their hand on their mouth, sat down and wept for 7 straight days. I would assume none of us have ever been that good of a friend. And yet, at the same time, I think part of what we're meant to recognize is that even though we've maybe never done that, we're just like them in so many ways, right? And if we were just to slow down for a minute and we would consider, why did they offer Job this counsel? It's not because they're bad friends. It says that at the end of chapter 2. Why did they give him this counsel? And it's because they believed, like everyone, that God only blesses the righteous. And therefore, Job receiving the opposite of blessing from God's hand had to have been due to some lack of righteousness. Again, friends, this is the wisdom of the day. And though that idea and even that theology, it's never presented as true in Scripture, this is what everyone believed to be true, including Job and his friends. This is why Job's friends offer the counsel that they do, and it's why Job offers the response to them and to God that he does. Because again, Job knows what his friends don't know, that he is righteous. He didn't do anything wicked, which is not to say that he didn't have any sin. That's not what the word righteous means. It's not what Job is saying, right? But he knows, Job knows, just like in our own suffering and the suffering of others sometimes, we know that their suffering is not because he's done something wicked. And what that does then is it exposes, and this is part of the whole purpose of Job in the wisdom literature of the Bible, it exposes this massive gap in the wisdom of the retributive principle that they all held to. This is the gap that's being exposed in their theological understanding, and certainly in their practical counsel, in their wisdom. And this gap is what led Job to question God's justice. And yet what I want us to see this morning in this is that this is the very gap. This is the very limitation in human wisdom here in chapters 4 to 37 that were being offered. Job's story, his suffering not only proves in its final chapters that what Satan contended about God and his ways is not true, right? Satan gets shut down. Job remains righteous. He maintains his fear of God, even when he's not being blessed for it, right? So in other words, Satan's wrong. We're going to hear about that here in a minute. Satan's challenge to God, not guilty, right? His accusation is false. Proves false. But Job's suffering also makes it clear that Job's accusations against God are unfounded as well. That is, what's being taught here, theologically and otherwise, is that God, Job's God, who is our God, God is under no obligation to bless the righteous. That was not assumed by Job and his friends, and it's still not assumed in the church. We may assume it on paper, theologically, if we're taking a test. It is not assumed emotionally and otherwise in our lives and in the lives of our churches. In fact, what is assumed is the same thing for most of us, functionally, that was assumed by Job and his friends. But God doesn't always, like Job and his friends and so many of us, all of us in certain ways, God doesn't always make sure that the righteous receive blessing and only blessing. And what this story is teaching us is that when God doesn't bless the righteous, as with Job, it makes God no less just, no less good, no less loving. And it certainly doesn't make our love for God or our love for our neighbors in vain. So in other words, the whole sort of input of Job here is that though this principle, this retributive principle may be generally true, it's not always true. That God's ways and life in this broken world, they're just not that simple. Even, and maybe we should say especially, now as we follow Jesus, and He's promised us we're going to be persecuted for following Him in various ways, even for the people of God. And friends, coming back to the key point here, that's precisely why there comes a time in our suffering where human wisdom runs out, where there's simply no explanation that we can come to. This is why. And to suffer well requires and invites us to embrace the mystery. The mystery. We hate mystery, even though we believe in a triune God. Mystery. But to embrace the mystery and the pain of this, which again, I know I hate. When I suffer, I don't want to suffer well. I want explanations. Like if I could just be vulnerable for a minute here. When things don't go my way, small things, big things, I want to be able to blame someone for my pain or the pain of others. I want to be able to say with all of my righteous indignation and anger and injustice that I'm just hurting because this person or that person did this or did that. Like even if the person to blame is myself, just give me someone or something to blame for the pain. In fact, my wife, who's just the best, she'll often say to me, "Why do you need someone to blame right now?" I mean, I go for it. Am I the only? You guys are looking at me like I need to blame. I need to go right at something or someone for this. Why do you need that, Shiraz? I'm like, because I do. Because I want to vent my anger. Because I want to be able to explain theologically or otherwise the source of my pain. Because otherwise, I'm just left with my pain. And depending on how significant the pain and the accompanying suffering to it is, I'm left with my disappointment with God. If I don't have somebody to blame, I'm left with God. And my disappointment ultimately with God, my proclivity to believe that God is not kind or not good or not just or not loving or not fill in the blank. That's why I like to blame others. Ultimately, I don't want to blame God. I don't want to go there. I'm having a good day. I was. For all sorts of reasons. We don't like being in a place where our wisdom, where our understanding or the wisdom or the understanding of others can't adequately explain things, which is why if I can't figure it out, if I can't decide who to blame, I'm going to call Pastor T, my old sage over there, and he's going to tell me, he's going to help me figure it out. He won't tell me who to blame. He'll do the opposite. But I'm just saying, I want to know. I don't want there to be a mystery to this. Which I think that makes sense. We want to know what's going on with our body, don't we? Where's this pain coming from? I want it to go away. I don't want to go to a doctor and them say, I don't know. You see, I specialize in this. Maybe you should go see these 3 people, and then they'll do the same. Like, we want to know. We don't like sitting in it. And what I just want you to sense is that in these chapters, you guys are doing so good with those videos. If these chapters, that is not too unlike what Job's friends do here in these conversations with him. They're attempting, like we do, to apply their wisdom in a situation where it doesn't belong, which is ultimately foolish. And if you'll notice, if you'll go back and read it, the speeches between them and Job, they get shorter and shorter each round, indicating literally that as Job responds to them with his own wise answers, as he maintains his innocence in response, his friends eventually run out of things to say. That's why the conversations get shorter and shorter and shorter. Slowly but surely, their wisdom, we're being taught as readers, is coming to an end. Whatever may have been generally true or generally wise in their understanding about God and about how He blesses the righteous and He, leads the wicked toward death, it was exposed by Job's suffering to not be universally true. It was exposed as being too shallow. Their wisdom was too shallow to explain everything. And so who is the truly wise person? Who has the wise perspective, the correct understanding of Job's suffering? Is it Job or his friends? It's none of them. Ultimately, what the story of Job is teaching us is that only God is truly wise, which then leads to the next section in chapter 28, which is Job's hymn or Job's poem about God's surpassing wisdom. And to me it seems, and I agree with some of the scholars that would say this, in chapter 28, if you want to go there, if there's maybe one place I'd encourage you to just, if you're going to read any of these 35 chapters that Morgan assigned me for our benefit today, Job 28, I'm done, Morgan, I won't say it again. Job 28 is one I'd encourage you to go back and read later, because it seems like Job seems to get clarity in the midst of his pain, a glimpse of clarity anyway. And I think that's something that all of us who suffer can relate to, right? That there's these moments where the fog will clear, like we'll be right in the middle of it, and there's moments where the fog will clear and we'll have, or maybe more accurately put, we'll be given a moment of clarity, not in terms of understanding everything, but in terms of just trusting God. Even if only for a moment. As Charles Spurgeon once put it, he said, these moments where even where we can't trace God's hand, we trust His heart. And I think that's what chapter 28 is for Job. It's one of these moments, and it's one of the most beautiful poems in the entire Old Testament. And in it, as Job comes out from underneath the yoke of his pain for just a moment, he's able to bless and extol God's wisdom and to exalt God for having a wisdom, unlike he and his friends, that never runs out. Right? A wisdom that is higher than the wisdom of even the wisest men like he and his friends. And you read that. Look at verse 20 of chapter 28. Where then does wisdom come from? Where is understanding located? It's hidden from the eyes of every living thing and concealed from the birds of the sky. Abaddon and death say, we have heard news of it with our ears. Verse 23, but God understands the way to wisdom, and He knows its location. Only God. The wisdom we're all looking for and talking about and going round and round in circles is only found by God, only known by God. And so Job here, this moment of he's humbling, he's acknowledging that his wisdom, as well as the wisdom of his friends, ultimately bow before the wisdom of God. And friends, part of suffering well is not just to acknowledge that we're suffering, acknowledge how much it hurts, acknowledge that we're frustrated and we wish we were never born, all those things. It's not simply to acknowledge that there's gaps in our wisdom. It's also to embrace this posture, a posture where amidst all the lingering questions and wise perspectives that we're seeking and the sense of injustice that we're feeling, we're coming before God humbly acknowledging that just because we can't imagine along with the best counselors, we can't imagine how God could possibly be just or loving in the face of these circumstances. We're humbly acknowledging He is. And in so many ways, this is ground zero, or pick your metaphor. This is ground zero in the fight of faith, in fighting the fight of faith for us, for our brothers and sisters in the midst of our suffering. In fact, last Sunday, our church, we sang a song that's called Firm Foundation. And the chorus of that song, it includes this declaration about God that proclaims He won't fail. Just over and over again, He won't fail. He's never failed, and He won't fail. When the storm and the winds and the suffering, He won't fail. It was the last song we sang, and then the greeting time, right after singing that song, I turned and I spoke with sorry this is a little fresh, but she's a young widow and now a single mother in our congregation with a young son who was sitting right behind me. We just finished singing that song, Stay Standing, why don't you greet one another? So I turned, gave her a hug. I've known her since she was 18 years old. And I said, how you doing, sister? And she confided, she said, I can't sing that song. And she wasn't saying it proudly or contentiously. She was confessing to me. She was saying with a hopeful longing, I want to sing it. I'm just struggling to reconcile what has happened to my husband and my life with God not failing. Because if I'm honest, that feels like He failed. It was just this tender, beautiful, vulnerable acknowledgement that this sister was making. And really, for me, it was this embodiment of that's the fight of faith. She was expressing, this is the fight of faith that I'm having in the midst of my suffering. This fight of learning to trust God's heart when we can't trace His hand, when it sure seems like He failed. And so I just stood there with her and shared areas and experiences in my own life where I've not yet reconciled God's wisdom and God's justice and God's love with the circumstances I've seen or experienced. And yet the posture is as important as the resolution, I think, in so many ways, right? And here what Job is modeling is not resolution. He's never given resolution, right? But what he models here is the posture that we hope and pray, if we're going to suffer well, God would lead us into by His good Spirit. A posture that says the best human wisdom, which is good. Human wisdom, whether it's explicitly Christian or not, it's good. We love it. We need it. But the best human wisdom, we're saying, cannot bring resolution here. And yet I know, God, I trust that You have a wisdom that is beyond ours. And in my pain, in my anguish, in my disappointment, in my exhaustion, I bow before Your wisdom. I bow before You, the God of wisdom. And this seems to be here in chapter 28. You can go reread it later. But this moment of clarity that Job has. And yet, as is often the case for us, this moment of clarity doesn't last. That's part of why I love Job. It's like, it doesn't last, which leads to the final speech of Job in chapters 29 to 31. And in chapters 29 to 31, Job returns, right after this hymn of wisdom, he returns to lamenting and brooding over the injustice of his circumstances. And of course, again, the deeper questions about God's love for him and whether his love for God and for others has even mattered at all. And in fact, in verse 20 of chapter 30 there, he says, God, You've turned a deaf ear toward me. Right? I know You're the keeper of all wisdom, but he's right back. I cry out to You for help, verse 20, but You don't answer me. When I stand up, You merely look at me. You don't speak to me. You don't answer me. You don't give me of Your wisdom. Right? Chapter 31, verse 35. Job begs for justice. You got to see this, where he says, if only I had someone to hear my case. He has put himself in a courtroom. He says, here's my signature. Here's my case. Here's my signature. This is my testimony. There it is, God. Answer me. Let the Almighty answer me. You see, God is on trial here in Job's heart. And part of what is so beautiful, again, about the way that the story of Job is arranged, theologically and literarily, is that it's not a linear arrangement. That is, it's more like what we experience in real life. Though Job has have a moment of clarity in chapter 28, where he's humbled himself before God's wisdom, he's now right back to the place of despair, right back to the place of questioning God's justice and love. And we are too. And so when you feel that, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, don't beat yourself up over that. That won't help you suffer well. I think part of what you can see here is that's just part of it. That's part of the process in our suffering. Which leads to then the final part, the final section of the story, where a man named Elihu responds to all Job has said. And that's in chapters 32 to 37. And unlike Job's 3 friends, Elihu, this guy, he's not an elder. He's the young buck, right? He's the one, he's been listening to the conversation between the elders the entire time. He's watched them speak to Job and apply their wisdom to his circumstance. He's watched Job respond to them with his wisdom and maintain his innocence, and he can't stand it. It's like the young 25-year-old's like, I'll tell you how to plant a church. I'll tell you how to raise your children. And I was that guy. I just had three conversations of flashbacks that I'm feeling some shame right now. But it's like, but he can't stand it, he's not going to stay silent anymore. He thought that these elders would take care of Job's accusation. And listen, again, I don't want to caricature this guy. He's worried about the honor of God. He's going to let Job sit there and dishonor God and call him unjust? You'd probably say something too. This guy, as misguided as and youthful as his fervor may be, I just trust he loves God. And so he's going to step in. And he speaks up. And what's interesting, again, if you go back and read these chapters later, what's interesting is that with all of his words, he doesn't actually offer anything new in the conversation. Let me just do a little tweet storm here. It's like, added nothing. Said nothing new, anyway. This is him. He comes back, that is, to the same old wisdom of the elders, the wisdom of retribution, saying that the reason that Job has suffered is because of his sin. He says it explicitly, chapter 34, verse 11, verses 25 to 27, verse 37. And in fact, it's interesting. Some scholars have actually argued that Elihu's speech, they've said it's a later addition to the story of Job. It's not actually original. And they argue that based on the fact that he doesn't say anything new. So they're like, why would they include this in the story? It's got to be a mistake that this is in the story, because he makes the essential same argument essentially as the other 3 did. And yet what others have pointed out that I agree with is that's precisely the point. The point of his speech being here is not only that it is original, but the point is that despite all of his righteous zeal, human wisdom has run out. It's over. And it's time for God to take the stage. And that's exactly what happens in chapter 38 and following, which is what the BD will focus our hearts on in the next section. But as we conclude, I just want to reiterate the main point I've tried to offer and then talk around, is that, again, there comes a time, if we're going to suffer well, it's good to know there comes a time in human suffering where human wisdom runs out. And the comfort we ultimately need in our suffering, it is found beyond human wisdom. It's found in trusting God's wisdom, in trusting the heart of the wise God alone. And as we look at Job as a model for how to do this, with all the messiness of how he moved through it, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, I would be remiss not to remind myself and all of us that we have an even better example, as good of an example as Job is. We have an even better example for Job than how to suffer well, and that's our Lord Jesus Christ. Sister, brother, Jesus is the true innocent sufferer, not Job. Right? Jesus is the only righteous person who was not just righteous in his daily life, but he was righteous and without sin ever. The only person, as Satan put it, that ever feared and loved God for God's sake alone. The only one who ever perfectly loved his neighbors. And of course, unlike Job, the Lord Jesus willingly submitted himself to suffering. Job didn't do that. Job did not choose it. He did not submit himself to it willingly. But Jesus did. He submitted himself willingly to suffering, to feeling and truly being on the cross, forsaken by God despite his righteousness. And on the cross, the Lord Jesus, the righteous one, he experienced far more than Job. The most undeserved and the worst suffering the world has ever seen. And I know that's hard for us as parents and people that love our kids. Like, Jesus' suffering is worse than that? Yes, it was worse than that. Being forsaken by God and having the judgment of God in our place on our behalf put upon him is worse than what happened to Job. And he did that willingly and never complained. And he did it because he loves us. All of us unrighteous ones who in all sorts of ways we have not loved or feared God and our neighbors as we ought, not even as Job did. And so as one scholar put it, he said, quote, that the Lord himself, the Lord Jesus, has embraced and absorbed all the consequences, the undeserved consequences of evil. That is actually the final answer to Job and to all the Jobs of humanity. Because Jesus himself is the very incarnation of the wisdom of God that Job was learning to trust. And because of what Jesus did, we who live on this side of the cross and the resurrection, we have a resource to suffer well that Job and his friends didn't. And though Jesus' death, it doesn't take away our suffering. It doesn't bring suffering to an end. In many ways, again, it adds to it. We still suffer in ways that we can't trace God's hand. But in Jesus, God has given us what we need, who we need to learn to trust his heart. Because we will never know in so many ways why we suffer, why what has happened to us has happened. But in Jesus' death for us, in our place, we can have confidence as we look at that whatever the reason is that we will never know, it's not because God doesn't love us. Which means that our love for God and our love for our neighbors and you being here at this conference this weekend to think about neighborhood churches, none of that is in vain, no matter what comes our way. And we know that because of Jesus. So I'm going to pray, I think. Is that what I'm doing? Okay. Master of ceremonies or whatever you called yourself earlier. Let me pray. And then are we transitioning into a panel or is there another pump fake here that, okay, great. No, I have nothing else. Lord, thank you for Job. Can't wait to learn more of these things of you that he spoke of in terms of your character. But we thank you for the example of needing to learn to trust your heart, needing to learn to trust your character. Would you teach us through Job's example to suffer well? And we just confess we don't. I mean, who really does? Save our Lord Jesus Christ. And Jesus, we bless you. We honor you. We thank you that because of you, we can trust in the love of God, in the justice of God, in the goodness of God, even as we sang earlier.